All right then, Econ Amigos. So thanks for staying with me for these videos. We're in the ADAS model. You now understand the model's basis. You learned about the key parts, the three components, AD, SRAS, LRAS. Then we learn how to put those together in order to find equilibrium, short run and long run. And then we extended that to think about the gaps, the recessionary and the inflationary gaps. And then we brought it full circle to monetary and fiscal policy by looking at and understanding how monetary and fiscal policies, expansionary and contractionary policies, played in to this model. Remember, the real key to both expansionary and contractionary policies generally is their impact on AD. Now, we also know from our our fiscal policy lectures that there's a school known as the supply side theory that attempts to influence the LRAS curve, okay, which we'll get into in an example in a moment. But anyway, thanks for staying with me. In this final video for this topic, I wanted to get you thinking about how to apply this ADAS model and practice it by taking a look at several real examples from American economic history. Okay, so let's jump in. In this one, you don't need to take notes so much as really just kind of watch, look at the event, think about what happened, and then apply it to the model. Okay, so first one, what we're going to analyze was the expansionary supply shock of the late 1800s, okay? And again, all this stuff is real American economic history. It's not abstract, not hypothetical. So between the years 1865 and 1896, the US economy grew rapidly. So it really grew rapidly. And again, when we say that it grew rapidly, remember we're talking about increases in real GDP. But what was remarkable was that the economy grew rapidly, even though prices were falling. How did this happen? Well, basically, during this period, the country saw both its SRAS and its LRAS curves increase. Specifically, as the nation's manufacturing sector boomed, we started creating and producing more. Innovation skyrocketed, and we also had immigration that led to a pretty rapid growth in the labor market. How did it all pan out? Well, you can see it here. And in these ones here, I'm taking away the LRAS. We'll just take a look at the SRAS and the AD. But basically, all these events, we started off right here in blue. And because of the rapid growth in American manufacturing capacity, because of the growth in immigration and labor market growth, because of the growth in some of the technologies and innovations, including management style innovations, we saw, we'll go to red, an increase in AS, which took us here. And there you go. So this period of American economic history was characterized by a positive supply shock as well as an increase in the LRAS. And we saw that our country was able to have rapid economic growth without inflation. Okay, so there's the reason why, as explained by the ADAS model. One thing to point out about this, by the way, you don't hear much about this. Nobody really talks about this a lot. Part of the reason is because it was a long time ago, but the real kind of underlying reason is this was a positive AS shock, right? We had an increase in AS, so that's an AS shock, and there's a positive one, which is to the right, okay? Well, number one, positive AS shocks, they lead to like pretty good things. You know, we always want prices to, you know, not increase and maybe even decrease a bit, and we want more output. So this was like a win-win. So because it was desirable, it didn't get anybody's attention. It didn't cause any kind of outrage. It didn't cause any kind of economic harm to most people. So it never really came up. At the same time, these positive AS shocks typically happen very gradually. So a big part of the reason why most of you probably have not heard about the expansionary window between 1865 and 1896, that's a whole generation of massive American growth, was because it helped people out and it happened really slowly. In contrast, our economic problems, the unemployment and inflation, those get a lot of political attention because they hurt people. And that's complicated by the fact that these things tend to happen very rapidly. So you're always going to hear about the bad things in the economy, but you don't always hear about the good things. Okay, but that was a positive AS shock. Next event, the expansionary demand shock of the 1960s. So in between the years 1964 and 1969, the American government was committed to two big things. Number one was funding the Vietnam War, and number two was funding the domestic goals of the Great Society program. So at the same time that the country was supplying for the war effort, which requires significant amounts of spending, it was also spending a lot of money for the domestic goals of the Great Society program. So what do we have? Well, we have an expansionary demand shock. And you can see here, this was a big increase in AD. We started off right here, AD1 and SRAS. And predictably, let's go to red, this massive increase. And by the way, most of this increase in AD was tied to big increases in G, because the war effort and the Great Society efforts required the government to spend a lot of money. If you're curious, you can go back and take a look at year by year numbers of the deficit and debt and take a look at the impact that these policies had on our country's deficit and debt. But anyway, G went up, shifting AD to the right, which brings us to a new equilibrium. Now, we did have much more output, but we also had some inflation, an increase in the price level. Okay, so that was an American episode in the 1960s. A decade later, in the 1970s, we had one that really hit our country hard. This was the contractionary supply shock of the 1970s. This was tied in large part to the OPEC oil cartel. We'll study cartels more in our micro series, but long story short, the OPEC oil cartel was a group of nations that produce oil globally. They worked together. We call it in economic theory collusion. They colluded or worked together to sharply reduce oil production. And as you know from our early lectures, as the supply of oil fell, the price of oil predictably skyrocketed. This happened twice. It happened in 1973 to 74, and again in 1979 to 1980. Again, in response to OPEC cartels' reduction of oil production quotas, we saw a global decrease in oil production. Predictably, we saw a global increase in oil prices. You know that oil is a critical component of supply. This led to a massive decrease in AS. The results were predictable. We have SRAS1 and AD, so our original situation here with our original output level and price level. And you guessed it, we're going to get the real bad one here. These oil shocks really pushed AS to the left, and predictably, it led to stagflation, with both a decrease in output, which led to skyrocketing unemployment, coupled with inflation. A double whammy that hit America actually twice in both 1974 and 1980 when we experienced stagflation. Okay. And then finally, well, actually, there's one more, two more. We saw in both the 1930s and again recently in 2007, 2008, and 2009, a contractionary demand shock. In the 1930s, our nation suffered the Great Depression. And then about 12 years ago, in 2007, 8, and 9, we had the Great Recession. These, when you look at them through the lens of ADAS, represented negative demand shocks. The economy it tumbled. If you remember our formula, well, we saw drastic drops in C and I, and therefore a big drop in AD, and you can see it right here. We started off SRAS and AD1, so here was the initial equilibrium with this output level. Well, we had these really, really drastic drops in AD, especially during the Great Recession. I mean, phenomenally high levels of unemployment took us to this new equilibrium. And you see here a very big output gap, a big recessionary gap corresponding to high levels of unemployment and a lot of social strife as well. Okay, so that was that one. Finally, I wanted to give you one more. During the 1990s, America, and this was really at the very kind of beginning of the upward swing of the tech sector and of all these different platforms that have become commonplace today. They really kind of kicked in during the 1990s tech boom. The American economy saw two distinct things happening simultaneously. Number one, there was dynamic growth in the tech sector. And tied to that dynamic growth, we saw lots of gains in productivity. As internet technology spread, as personal computing got cheaper, as companies were able to bring in different types of software to make their ops more efficient. So we saw on one hand, this dynamic growth in the tech sector, which increased productivity. At the same time, because companies were eager to get in, we saw rapid increases in business spending. So this led to a couple of different things. We saw output rise strongly, but at the same time, the price level only increased modestly. Now, this is kind of weird because you would think, going back to some of our, where were they over here? One of our other ones, when we saw AD go up here, we saw a big increase in prices. So people have asked the question, how did the 1990s have such rapid growth in investment spending without massive inflation? Well, the answer is this increase in AD was in large part offset by the growth of productivity, which reinforces our ideas from the economic growth discussion about how damn important economic growth is. Here's how it looks. We start off again with price level here and GDP here, and these are real numbers. In 1992, if you take a look at this, the American GDP was about 9 trillion. And the price level was at about 71. And you can see here in 1992, we have LRAS, SRAS, and AD. So we have this long run equilibrium here. Well, between 1992 and the year 2000, we saw massive increase in business spending, which led to a huge increase in the AD curve. If everything else were equal, you would have expected this to cause some pretty decent inflation. But everything else was not equal, because at the same time that AD went up, we had that productivity boom. So we saw both LRAS and SRAS go up. So here, I'll put it in red, you can see the increase in our supply curves. And the end result, my friends, was that by the year 2000, here in red, we had this new long run equilibrium, which corresponded to a way, way higher GDP. The American economy experienced tremendous growth. But fortunately, because of that jump in productivity, if you go across here, that big jump in growth only cost us moderate levels of price increase. This is what happens when an economy grows its productive capacity. We can have more consumption, spend more money, generate more total income, grow the GDP without having to suffer the effects of really bad inflation. This is what happened in the 1990s, and it still today serves as a case study for people who try to advocate for policies to grow the productive capacity of the economy. They say, hey, listen, we had this big increase in AD, but it didn't hurt inflation because it was offset by increases in productivity. This is also part of the basis behind the supply side theories that really advocate through lower taxes and lower regulations and minimal government involvement and investment in R&D and institutional growth, that by growing the economy's productive capacity, we can have more stuff without the drawback of inflation. All right, my friends, this has been a pretty complicated series. Do me a favor, go through these notes, make sure you read the chapter. I've also posted some practice questions for you. Go through this stuff. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, thanks for joining me. Thanks for tuning in and staying with me, and I'll see you next time. Take care.